All right, let's jump right in, shall we? Today's deep dive takes us into the world of urban planning, focusing on how cities are being built in the GCC region. And you know what? The ARKAT YouTube podcast episode you sent over. Yeah, that's some seriously thought-provoking stuff. I mean, here's this firm right in the middle of everything, and they're calling us out. They're saying, hey, let's not just import ideas from other places. Let's think critically about what actually works best in our unique context.
It's about time, right? I mean, how many times have we seen those cookie cutter urban designs that just don't make sense in a desert environment? They're
Yeah.
pushing for a more, I guess you could say, contextually rooted approach. I think that's where the real magic lies.
Right. It's like they're saying, hey, we live in a desert. Let's design cities that actually work with the desert, not against it. And that whole idea, the idea that so much of what we see in GCC cities today is based on these foreign models, often completely unsuited for this climate, yeah, that really hit home for me. The kind of urban sprawl where you absolutely need a car to get anywhere.
Exactly. And ARCAT argues that this heavy reliance on single-use zoning,
Mm.
where everything is separated by function, like you've got your residential areas way over here, your commercial districts miles away, and industrial zones somewhere else entirely. It's like they're saying, hey, let's make it as difficult as possible for people to get around without a car.
It's crazy when you think about it that way. I mean, it's like we've designed these cities that are almost fighting against the very environment they exist in. But here's what I find fascinating. They're not saying we should scrap everything and start from scratch. No, they're looking to the past, to traditional building practices for inspiration. And that name, ARKAT, it actually means a series of arches in Arabic. It's like their name embodies their whole philosophy.
It's a really cool concept. And they're not just being nostalgic here. They're talking about taking those ancient techniques, like those wind towers you see in traditional architecture, or how buildings are oriented to minimize sun exposure. And then here's the key, marrying those techniques with modern technology.
It's about understanding the brilliance of what worked so well in the past, and then applying that knowledge to design buildings that are naturally cooler and more sustainable. They're talking about working with the environment, not trying to dominate it.
Absolutely. They use the example of Masdar City. By incorporating these passive design strategies, they've managed to create a city that's 10 to 15 degrees Celsius cooler than the surrounding areas. Can you imagine being able to comfortably walk around outside even in the summer?
That changes everything. I mean, think about how that would transform public spaces, how it would make the city more walkable. It's a game changer for sure.
Oh, absolutely. And that kind of temperature difference,
Hmm.
it doesn't just make life more pleasant, It has a massive impact on energy consumption. If we can reduce our reliance on air conditioning even a little bit, well, that's a huge step towards a more sustainable future.
It's like we've been approaching the problem from the wrong angle all along. Instead of trying to blast away the heat with more and more AC, why not design buildings that work with the climate in the first place? And speaking of sustainability, their take on transit-oriented developments, or TODs, is really intriguing.
You're talking about those dense, mixed-use areas centered around public transit hubs, right? It's the idea that you could live in a place where you can walk to work, the grocery store, the gym, all within a few minutes of a metro station.
Exactly. It's like they're saying, hey, let's design cities where you don't have to rely on a car for every single trip. And the best part is, it's not just good for the environment, it's actually good for your wallet, too.
ARCAT points out that well-designed TODs can actually boost property values by up to 42%.
Wow. So not only are you getting convenience and sustainability, but you could also be making a savvy investment. That's a win-win in my book.
Yeah.
And they don't just stop there, right? They go on to tackle the whole issue of street networks. They're arguing that we need to shift away from those car-centric designs and create streets that prioritize, pedestrians and cyclists.
Yeah, they bring up Barcelona as an example, a city with a grid-like street pattern that makes it super walkable and connected. And get this, they argue that even simple changes, like adding more shade trees and dedicated pedestrian lanes, can have a huge impact on how people experience the city.
It's like they're saying, let's make it actually pleasant to walk around instead of an endurance test.
Exactly. And they even share this personal anecdote. One of them was talking about how they live just a 3-minute walk from a salon, but because there's basically no shade and barely any sidewalks, it's easier to just drive.
It's so relatable. It really highlights how these small design choices, these seemingly insignificant things, can totally influence our decisions about how we get around. But, for ARCAT, it's not just about practicality, it's about something bigger. They're talking about how urban design can be used to create, well, a sense of place. a sense of community, even a sense of wonder.
And this idea of like thoughtful design, it extends to landmark projects too. They're talking about how iconic buildings can act as catalysts for urban renewal. They even bring up the Bilbao effect, how the Guggenheim Museum completely revitalized the city of Bilbao in Spain. But here's the thing, they're not saying we should just drop a flashy building in the middle of nowhere and expect magic to happen.
Right. It's not about the building in isolation. It's about how that building interacts with its surroundings.
Exactly. They argue that we need to focus on, get this, enhancing the spaces between those landmarks. It's about creating a vibrant, pedestrian-friendly environment that encourages exploration and interaction. Like, you know, imagine walking from one museum to the next, exploring charming cafes and shops along the way. That's the kind of experience they're advocating for.
So they're saying, let's not just create destinations, let's create journeys.
Right.
And you know what? Their case study of the cultural district in Abu Dhabi, that really drives this point home. You got all these amazing museums, right? But the surrounding area, it's kind of lacking that sense of activation and connectivity.
It's like having all these beautiful ingredients, but not knowing how to put them together to make a delicious meal.
Exactly. And then you have mega projects, which, let's be honest, the GCC is known for its ambitious development projects.
Oh, yeah, we've got those in spades. But ARKAT is challenging us to think about those mega projects through a different lens. They're saying, hey, let's make sure these projects are actually guided by long-term sustainability goals and integrated with the existing city fabric.
Instead of creating these isolated mini-cities that don't really connect with anything around them, they actually point to Lusail City in Qatar as a positive example. It's a mega project, but it was designed with sustainability and connectivity in mind right from the start.
And it demonstrates that you can have both ambition and innovation without sacrificing sustainability. It's about finding that sweet spot.
They're raising the bar, that's for sure. And one of the things that really struck me was their passion for this concept of adaptive reuse.
Yeah.
It's about giving existing buildings a new life instead of just tearing them down and starting from scratch. They see it as a way to preserve cultural heritage, reduce environmental impact, and create these unique spaces that have, character and history.
And they bring up Al Circle Avenue in Dubai. It's an amazing example of this. You've got all these old warehouses that have been transformed into a thriving arts and culture hub. It's like they've taken something that was once forgotten and breathed new life into it.
It's about recognizing the value of what already exists and finding creative ways to reimagine it. And they don't stop there. They're also passionate about preserving vernacular architecture, those traditional building styles that are, unique to the region. They worry that in our rush to modernize, we're losing sight of these treasures.
And you know what? They're right. I mean, think about those beautiful traditional houses you see in older parts of Dubai with the wind towers and the intricate details. They represent a part of our history, our identity. And if we're not careful, we're going to lose that.
It's like they're saying, hey, let's not just build for the future. Let's honor the past as well. It's about creating cities that are not just functional and sustainable, but also rich in culture and history. Cities that tell a story.
Exactly. Cities with soul. And then they hit us with a real gut punch. They bring up affordable housing, which, let's be honest, is often overlooked in the rush to build these shiny new developments.
It's the elephant in the room, right? But ARKAT is saying, hey, we can't ignore this issue. Without affordable housing, we're creating cities that are increasingly unequal and, frankly, unsustainable.
They point out that when affordable housing is scarce in central areas, it forces lower-income groups to move to the outskirts. And then what happens? Longer commutes, more traffic congestion, a heavier environmental footprint. It's a vicious cycle.
And their solution? They're advocating for policies that incentivize mixed-income housing developments. It's about creating more inclusive and accessible cities where everyone has a chance to thrive.
And that brings us to what might be the most exciting part of their approach. They're constantly looking at other cities around the world, searching for best practices and innovative ideas that they can adapt to the GCC context. They were really impressed, for example, by Copenhagen's cycling infrastructure. In Copenhagen, despite the cold climate, over 70% of residents use bicycles to get to work.
Wow, that's a pretty stark contrast to what we see here. I mean, we complain about the heat, but they've somehow made cycling work, even in freezing temperatures. How do they do it?
Well, it's a combination of things, really. They've got this incredible network of dedicated bike paths, traffic calming measures to make it safer for cyclists, and a culture, a culture that actually prioritizes cycling.
It makes you wonder, right? If they can pull that off in Copenhagen, why not here?
ARKAT seems to think it's possible. They believe that similar approaches can be adopted in the GCC. Of course, it might seem like a long shot given our current car-centric culture, but they're suggesting that we start small. Start with small-scale interventions, things like protected bike lanes, bike sharing programs, just to kind of get the ball rolling.
It's about showing people that there are other options, right?
Yeah.
Other ways to get around besides being stuck in traffic.
Exactly. And speaking of alternatives to driving, ARCAT is also really big on investing in robust public transportation systems.
Which, let's be honest, sometimes feels like a pipe dream in the GCC.
I know, right? But they point out that cities like London and Hong Kong, which are incredibly dense and complex, have managed to make public transportation a central part of their urban fabric. It makes you wonder, if they can do it, why can't we?
I think for a lot of people here, there's this assumption that public transport just can't work in the GCC, because of the heat and the distances involved.
Right. It's almost like this built-in excuse. But ARCAT is challenging that assumption. They highlight cities with even hotter climates than ours that have thriving public transportation systems.
It's like they're saying, look, it's not the climate that's the problem, it's the lack of will.
Exactly. It's about having the political will to invest in the right infrastructure and to actually create a system that's, reliable, comfortable, and accessible to everyone.
And it's not just about convenience and sustainability either.
Uh-huh.
ARCAT also emphasizes the economic benefits of investing in public transport.
Oh, absolutely. They mention that every dollar invested in public transit generates $4 in economic return.
Right, $4. That's incredible.
I know, right? Compare that to highways, which only generate about $1.50 in returns for every dollar invested. It's a no-brainer.
It's like they're saying, let's invest in something that actually makes sense, both for the environment and for the economy. And speaking of smart investments, they're not saying that we should completely abandon the idea of iconic buildings and mega projects, but they argue that these projects need to be approached thoughtfully. They need to be integrated into the existing urban fabric, not just dropped in as isolated statements.
They bring up the Bilbao effect again, but caution against simply plopping down a flashy building and expecting it to magically transform a city. They stress that the surrounding area needs to be activated, needs to be connected to the rest of the city for the project to truly have a positive impact.
It's like, you could have the most amazing centerpiece on your dining table, but if the rest of the table is bare, it just doesn't have the same effect.
You need those supporting elements, those details, to create a complete and fulfilling experience.
Exactly. And speaking of details, I love how ARCAT is so passionate about preserving the existing character and history of a city. They're big proponents of adaptive reuse, taking those old buildings that might otherwise be demolished and giving them a new lease on life.
Like, they highlight Al Circle Avenue in Dubai, where they took these old warehouses and turned them into a vibrant cultural hub. It's such a cool example of how preserving the past can actually add to the attractiveness of a city.
It's about recognizing the value of what's already there, and finding creative ways to reimagine it for the future. And it's not just about preserving individual buildings either. They're also passionate about preserving vernacular architecture, those traditional building styles that reflect a region's cultural heritage.
It's easy to forget in our rush to modernize that these buildings are not just relics of the past. They're a testament to the ingenuity of our ancestors.
They represent a connection to our roots, a sense of continuity.
Right. And this respect for the past also influences their approach to sustainable building practices. They're big on passive design techniques, drawing inspiration from those traditional building methods that have stood the test of time.
Like those wind towers we talked about earlier. They're a perfect example of how, back in the day, people used simple but incredibly effective design strategies to create comfortable living spaces in a challenging climate.
It's like they're saying, hey, why reinvent the wheel when we can learn from the wisdom of the past?
Exactly. And then there's this whole other layer to their approach, and that's their emphasis on data in urban planning. It's like they're saying, look, let's move beyond gut feelings and assumptions and start using data to make informed decisions about how we design and manage our cities.
They're talking about the smart city, where technology and data are used to optimize things like traffic flow, energy consumption, waste management. Imagine a city that could actually anticipate and respond to problems before they even arise.
That would be amazing. It's like having a crystal ball for your city. But I appreciate that ARCAT is also careful to point out that technology is not a silver bullet. It's a tool, and like any tool, it can be used for good or for bad.
Right. Sustainability isn't just about having the fanciest gadgets. It's about creating a holistic system that works for both people and the planet. And that brings us to another key aspect of their approach, the idea of multiscalar planning.
Multiscalar planning. Okay, I'm intrigued. What's that all about?
It basically means that you have to consider the impact of your decisions at different levels, global, national, and local. For example, climate change is a global issue, but its effects are felt very locally. So urban planning needs to address both the big picture and the specific needs of individual communities.
It's like those Russian nesting dolls. Each level is connected to the others, and you have to consider the whole set to understand how things work.
Exactly. And speaking of understanding how things work, I found their discussion of street networks really insightful. They argue that well-designed street networks are absolutely essential for walkability, connectivity, and just the overall livability of a city.
They contrasted those grid-like street patterns you see in cities like Barcelona with the more, disconnected and car-centric layouts that are common in the GCC. And they pointed out how those grid-like patterns can actually shorten the distance between points, which encourages walking and cycling. It just creates a more pedestrian-friendly environment.
It's amazing how something as seemingly simple as the layout of streets can have such a profound impact on how people live and interact with their city.
It's like the bones of the city, right?
Yeah.
The street network is the skeleton that everything else is built upon. And they don't just talk about the big picture either. They also get into the nitty-gritty details of what makes a street truly walkable. Like, remember how they talked about the importance of shade, especially in a climate like ours?
Oh, yeah. Shade is essential here. It's about creating an environment where people actually want to be outside, where
Yeah.
they feel comfortable walking even when it's hot. And they also advocate for things like dedicated pedestrian lanes and cycling infrastructure. They argue that even these small interventions can make a big difference in encouraging people to choose alternative modes of transport.
It's about making the healthy choice the easy choice, right?
Yeah, exactly. If you make it convenient and enjoyable, people are much more likely to walk or cycle instead of automatically hopping in their car. And it all circles back, to one of the most crucial elements for creating truly sustainable and equitable cities, public transportation. ARKAT is like a huge advocate for investing in really robust public transportation systems. It's essential, they argue, for reducing traffic congestion, promoting sustainability, and creating cities that are more equitable.
It's funny because they highlight how cities like London and Hong Kong, which are incredibly dense and complex, they've managed to integrate public transportation into the very fabric of their urban life.
Wow.
Which makes you think, if they can do it, why can't we?
Exactly. And they make a great point that it's not just about the physical infrastructure itself, it's also about creating a culture that embraces public transport. It has to be reliable, it has to be efficient, and it has to be accessible to everyone.
It has to be seen as a desirable option, not a last resort.
Right. And they brought up a point that really resonated with me, the economic benefits of investing in public transportation. They said every dollar invested in public transit generates $4 in economic returns.
Wait, $4? For every dollar invested? That's amazing.
I know, right? And then they compare that to highways, which only generate about $1.50 in returns for every dollar invested.
So it's not just good for the environment, it's actually good for the economy, too.
Exactly. It's a win-win on so many levels. And I love that they're always looking for inspiration, beyond just the GCC. Like they were so impressed by Copenhagen's cycling infrastructure. They pointed out that over 70% of Copenhagen residents commute by bike, even in freezing temperatures.
It's incredible, right? They've created a culture where cycling is just like a normal part of life.
And ARCAT believes we can learn a lot from their approach. They suggest starting with those small-scale interventions, protected bike lanes, bike sharing programs, and then gradually expanding the network as ridership grows.
Can you imagine Dubai with a thriving cycling culture? That would be so cool. It would transform how we experience the city.
Totally. It would make the city healthier, more sustainable, more vibrant.
And it would show, a real commitment to creating a city that works for people, not just cars. I think what's so inspiring about ARKAT is their willingness to challenge conventional wisdom. They're constantly pushing the boundaries of what's possible in urban planning.
They're not afraid to question the status quo, which is so refreshing.
Right. And they're always looking for ways to improve, to innovate, to create cities that are truly worthy of the people who live in them. I really loved how they talked about the misconception that public transportation just can't work in the GCC because of the heat.
They completely debunked that myth.
They did. They pointed to all these examples of cities with even hotter climates than ours that have thriving public transport systems.
It's not about the climate, it's about having the will to make it happen.
Right. It's about having the vision and the commitment to invest in the future. And to wrap things up, they shared their personal journeys into urban planning, which was really cool. It
Yeah.
gives you a glimpse into, the experiences that shaped their passion for creating better cities.
I love how they talked about how urban planning is about more than just, buildings and infrastructure. It's about people. It's about their lives and how they experience the city.
One of them talked about being inspired by this massive urban renewal project in Boston. They saw how thoughtful design could transform a city, and create these spaces that foster a sense of community and belonging.
And the other one that talked about growing up in Dubai and witnessing this rapid development firsthand and how it made them want to create cities that are more responsive to the needs of the people who live there.
It's a great reminder that, at the end of the day, urban planning is about people. It's about creating spaces that are not just functional and sustainable, but also beautiful, inspiring, and connected to the human experience. So what stood out to you the most from this deep dive? What resonated with you? What are you taking away from this conversation?
It's definitely been eye-opening, just thinking about the challenges and the opportunities facing our cities. They've given us a lot to think about, for sure.
They've challenged us to think differently about the cities we live in, to imagine a better future.
It can be easy to get overwhelmed by the scale of the problems. But they remind us that change starts with small steps.
Exactly. It starts with a willingness to reimagine what's possible.
So let's keep exploring, keep questioning, keep imagining.
The future of our cities is in our hands.